We've heard a lot of discussion about being brothers and sisters, and maybe we ought to examine that a little bit. Now, we really are brothers and sisters, whether we want to be or not. And you see, that's the fundamental thing about a family. I didn't choose my parents. I don't know about y'all. I didn't choose my brothers and sisters or cousins. I had nothing to do with it. If I could have chose some, I might have made some changes. That's the nature of a family. You're a family not because you want to be related to someone, but because that's the way the world is. And all of us in our families have people that we can't stand. We can all say this openly now. I mean, you might have to go have Thanksgiving dinner with them, but, right? All of us. We are not allowed the privilege of choosing who are going to be members of our family. Labor is, in fact, a family whether we want to be or not. We only have one thing that we bring to the world, our ability to work. That's all. And that's what makes us a family. And it doesn't really matter what language we speak or whether we think we're better off than someone else. The fact is, whether we want to be or not, we are a family. Now, some families make it and some families don't. And therein lies our problem. Some families survive and flourish and help each other out, and some families dissolve and get scattered to the winds, and you never hear from them again. And that is the issue that faces us. What are we going to do to change things in our locals, in the National Council, in the labor councils, in the Federation, and the CLC? That is an appropriate focus. It's healthy, it's good. But it's important that while we focus on those actions that we need to take, that we take some time to understand the nature and source, the root problems of racism. There is no question within every union in this country, in every church, in every institution, racism is a problem. It exists. The question is, what is racism? Because you see, if we don't understand what it is, then we can't fight it. If we don't understand the nature of racism, then we'll be forced to continue to live with it. It is true that racism is part, unfortunately, of the labor movement, our family. But it's also critical that we understand that labor is not the source of that racism. Now, this is an important distinction. Racism is not simply being prejudiced. It's not simply the issue of discrimination. Racism has very little to do with individual beliefs and individual ignorance. It is true that people who are individually ignorant are racist, that's true, but that's not where racism comes from. It really has nothing to do with brown eyes and blue eyes or being short and tall. It really doesn't. We have lots of prejudice and discrimination in Canada. But you see, the discrimination against the French in this country, as abhorrent as it is not racism. There have been times in this country when to be a Ukrainian was the kiss of death. Some people tell me it's still that way. But that's not racism. There's discrimination against Catholics or Jews or Italians or Portuguese. And all of these things are bad and they must all be fought, but that is not synonymous with racism. The problem that we face as women is a serious problem, but it's not the same thing as racism. So it's important that we look at this and ask ourselves, what is racism? How did it come about? What is its role in our society? Racism is an ideology, a carefully constructed set of beliefs that is intertwined and intimately connected with a specific time in history, a specific period in history. Prejudice against the guy that lives across the river or someone that lives across the lake, that's something that's gone on since the beginning of time. But racism is specific to a certain time period. Brothers and sisters, we need to say it openly because otherwise we can't fight it. Racism is an essential undergirding. It is a critical pillar of capitalism. That's what it is. It did not always exist. It was invented as one of the tools of building the world that we live in today. If you remove the historical understanding of racism, then you'll never be able to deal with it. It is part of the fabric and structure of this country. That's why it's so difficult to fight. If it were simply ignorance and stereotypes, we could deal with it in one generation. But it's not that. It's part of what built the nation. How does this function? How did it work? First, in Canada and the United States, in the West Indies and in Mexico and South America, all throughout this hemisphere, first and foremost, racism was used as an excuse for trying to wipe out a whole group of people. Genocide, trying to wipe out the native indigenous people. And that to kill them was to improve the land. Think about that. To wipe out everyone in the Caribbean, they almost successfully did that. They were a little less efficient in North America. Somehow was civilizing the islands. Never before, we've had wars forever. Never before in the history of mankind did we see such successful, systematic genocide as we saw in the Western Hemisphere when the first explorers came. Secondly, and part of that, at the same time, was the subjugation of the peoples in Africa and Asia. This is not an accident. This is part and parcel of what happened. Go back and read your history. This is how they gained enough money to build the big textile mills. This is what the Industrial Revolution was based on. It didn't have to be based on that, but this is what it was based on. The wealth of Europe was built on taking land in the Western Hemisphere, on depopulating Africa through the slave trade, on subjugating India and Asia, on carving up what we now call the Third World. Why? Because we said, those people are inferior. The question of racism, then, cannot be divorced from this history. This is why it is that a worker from Jamaica, no matter how long they stay in Canada, is treated differently than a worker from Poland, or a worker from Yugoslavia, or a worker from Italy. This is why. It's not just that people come as new immigrants to a country and they don't speak the language. Listen, when the labor movement was first organized, most of the folks didn't speak English. Now, I know the British try to pretend that everybody speaks English, but see, when the labor movement was first organized, there were lots of workers who spoke Polish, or Lithuanian, or Italian, or Portuguese, that are part of the history of this labor movement. And there were organizers who spoke those languages, and there were labor newspapers written in those languages, and the union meetings were held in those halls and in those churches. When labor didn't own a hall anywhere in the country, those communities are part of that history, part of why we're here today. Racism then is critical to how capitalism functions. First, by allowing and justifying the expropriation of most of the world for one small part and even one small group within that part of the world. Secondly, by continuing to justify the exploitation of the bulk of the world. And by creating, in Canada, especially in the United States, but all over the world, by creating false divisions, by dividing us as a family, as a class, among each other. You see, racism is not really an oversight. It's not an accident. It's not like the ideals of Canada or the ideals of democracy somehow went astray. It's not like that. It didn't happen that way. When the U.S. Constitution was written, they were very clear that we weren't people. We counted as 3/5 of a person. We couldn't vote either, but we counted as 3/5 of a person. Not an accident. A deliberate, carefully planned strategy. So when we talk about racism as a problem, when we listen to brothers and sisters talk about issues in their locals, we have to ask ourselves, who does racism benefit? Why was it invented? And who does it serve? It doesn't serve us. It serves the bosses, the ruling class. That's who it serves. That's what it was invented for. They are the ones who propagated it. They are the ones who continue to benefit from it. It was used and it is still used as justification for raping the world. And today in Canada, it is used as the major weapon for keeping us divided. It is the primary strategy of our enemy. Make no mistake about it, it's their number one weapon, their strongest and most powerful tool. As long as they can continue to teach generation after generation that racism has some currency, some value, as long as they continue to convince us that somehow we have nothing in common with each other, then they will continue to be on top. That is what we mean when we talk about racism being institutionalized, being systemic to Canada. You see, it's not an issue of individual morality. One brother said earlier he wasn't interested in people liking him. That's not the issue. The issue is understanding what it is that our enemy uses against us and how we can change that. Certainly, racism uses tools with which we're all familiar: fear, ignorance, stereotypes, language differences, prejudice. All of these things are used. But fundamentally, its major use is to prop up capitalism. And if, in fact, we want to guarantee the simple things we have fought for in labor, then we will understand that we cannot guarantee any of those things unless we deal with racism. And while it's important that we understand that racism only benefits the ruling class, that they are the ones who have invented it, and they are the ones who continue to teach it, it's also critical that we understand that racism does not hurt everyone equally. It hurts everyone in this room, but not equally. Racism is like a flood that you can't turn back. It seeps in all the cracks and crevices. Wherever there isn't someone on guard, it comes in. Because it is so much a part of our society. That's why it's so critical that human rights committees exist in every local and that they be active. It's critical that you stop and ask yourself at every point, are we dealing with racism? Are we fighting racism? Because it is the norm in this country. And if you're not actively fighting it, you can be sure that it's at work weakening your union, weakening your local, causing trouble. Racism is an issue that involves all of us. When we understand that, then we will not only be able to defeat racism, we will be able to continue our fight for a world where peace, justice, and sisterhood reign. Thank you.